I think you have so much to do, you don't have time to get even. You only have time to get right.
Well, revenge does take time, I will say that.
It does.
And sometimes revenge can be justified, Phil. I have to be honest. You know, sometimes it can.
Do you regret not locking her up? And if you're president again, will you lock people up?
Well, I'll give you an example. The answer is you have no choice because they're doing it to us.
The Constitution says treason is punishable by death. You've accused your adversaries of treason. Who specifically are you accusing of treason?
Well, I think a number of people. If you look at Comey, if you look at McCabe, if you look at probably people higher than that, if you look at Strzok, if you look at his lover, Lisa Page, it's a Democrat charging his opponent. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. That means that if I win and somebody wants to run against me, I call my attorney general. I say, listen, indict him.
It's his attorney general voice. Hi, everyone. It's 5 o'clock in New York. As the great Maya Angelou puts it, when someone shows you who they are, when they tell you who they are, believe them. And the disgraced, twice impeached, 4 times indicted ex-president has been telling us exactly who he is and how he plans to wield his power if he returns to the White House out loud from podiums for years now. He has made clear he is running on his intention to prosecute and, quote, take down his perceived political enemies. And make no mistake at this point, this is not bluster. These are not empty promises. Just ask Jim Comey or Pete Strzok or Andrew McCabe or Lisa Page or any of the other people whose lives were upended when they landed on Trump's enemy list and were subjected to investigations or audits or had their reputations constantly smeared. And now, with just 43 days until the election, there is bombshell new investigative reporting in the New York Times exposing what was actually happening behind the scenes during Donald Trump's first term, as he went on the warpath against his perceived political enemies and the extraordinary network of Trump aides who narrowly succeeded in slowing him down. Mike Schmidt from the New York Times writes about the spring of 2018 when, quote, Donald Trump, faced with an accelerating inquiry into his campaign's ties to Russia, was furious that the Justice Department was reluctant to strike back at those he saw as his enemies. Quote, in an Oval Office meeting, Mr. Trump told startled aides that if then Attorney General Jeff Sessions would not order the department to go after Hillary Clinton and Jim Comey, Trump would prosecute them himself. Quote, recognizing the extraordinary dangers of a president seeking not just to weaponize the criminal justice system for political ends, but trying as well to assume personal control over who should be investigated and charged, White House counsel Don McGahn sought to stall. Quote, how about I do this, McGahn told Trump, according to an account verified by witnesses. Quote, I'm going to write you a memo explaining to you what the law is and how it works. And I'll give that memo to you, and you can decide what you want to do. Schmidt writes that this, quote, marked the start of a more aggressive effort by Trump to deploy his power against his perceived enemies, despite warnings not to do so by top aides, and underscored what Schmidt calls, quote, a pattern where after Trump made repeated public or private demands for someone to be targeted by the government, that person then faced federal pressure of one kind or another. And that this, quote, has a powerful resonance today as Trump threatens to carry out a campaign of retribution if he returns to the White House, and has signaled that a second Trump administration would be stocked not with people who served as guardrails during his first term, but with carefully vetted loyalists who would eagerly carry out his wishes. It's where we start the hour. Some of our favorite reporters and friends with us at the table. New York Times investigative reporter Mike Schmidt is here. He is bylined on that piece of reporting, plus former assistant U.S. attorney, author of Remember, You Are a Wiley. Maya Wiley's back with us. Also joining us, professor of history at NYU, Ruth Ben-Ghiat joins us. Mike, take us through what you're reporting.
I mean, I guess there's a lot there, but I think the thing that struck me the most about all of it is when we went back and we looked at what Trump said publicly and we looked at what he did privately, and then we looked what happened to these people. And pretty much for every person that he wanted investigated or targeted or gone after, something happened to them. And that was just a pattern that was really hard to look away from. It's criminal investigations, it's IRS audits, and this happened in 2020 around the books, but it's lawsuits against people who had written books against him. And all of that was just kind of startling because there's so much that happens with Trump on a day-to-day basis on so many different issues that keeping track of it can be hard. But when we took that step back and looked at the wreckage, it was more substantial than we thought. And this coming from a person myself who had spent an enormous amount of time trying to understand this issue. So, you know, is there a direct order that we have where Donald Trump said, you know, go do this? No, but Donald Trump in 2018, right after McGahn writes these memos to him, says that John Kerry should be prosecuted or investigated for the Logan Act. And 2 days later, SDNY gets a call from the Justice Department, or in a conversation, they say, begin this investigation into John Kerry. When Trump tweets about the investigation a year later, this is all in Berman's book. When Trump tweets about it a year later, DOJ calls SDNY to ask why they haven't been taking an investigative step. There's a unique type of power that Trump was able to use, this sort of public and private pressure, where he could say things publicly, he could get them into the ether, he could, behind the scenes, push on aides, push on the attorney general. And by the end of it, you have Hillary Clinton that has to sit down with John Durham, with her lawyer David Kendall next to her, and answer all these crazy questions about Clinton 2016 Russia conspiracy theories. So everyone, you know, we kind of start this reporting, we say, okay, well, you know, what's he going to do if he comes back? You know, got this Marco Rubio quote where Marco says, you know, the only vengeance he's going to seek is, you know, making America great again. He's not going to go after his political opponents. And what we said was, well, actually, it already happened. And it happened in a more substantial way than we thought. And that's why we wrote as much as we did about it.
Why did they write memos?
So Don McGahn and John Kelly had a way of dealing with Trump. If Trump wanted to do something and it was outright illegal, Kelly would say to Trump, you can't do it. Go to Congress, get Congress to get you to do it. And Trump would just get frustrated and go away. The problem that they ran into, that Kelly and McGahn ran into, is the crack between things that are legal but they're wrong. So Trump could meddle in the Justice Department. That's a post-Watergate norm. That's not laid out in the law. So when they ran into those cracks like they did in 2018, and Trump wanted to get involved in Justice Department investigations, it was harder for them because they would have to explain to him, yes, you have the power to do this, but no, you shouldn't do it. And when they ran into those cracks, what they did was they wrote memos. And McGahn's office wrote these memos, in this instance, to Trump about why intervening in Justice Department investigations is a bad idea, including telling him in the memo, in one of the drafts of the memos that we have, that a consequence of this could be at the ballot box. You could lose at the ballot box. You could be impeached because of this, because of all of this. And what happens is that they write these memos and it's given to Trump. And it's hard to think that Trump read a 12-page memo about, you know, the sensitivities of the post-Watergate norms of the line between the White House and the Justice Department. But what happens in the weeks afterwards is that drafts of these memos were smuggled out of the White House. Now, why were they smuggled out of the White House? Because the people around the president didn't trust what he was going to do. And they wanted to have evidence that backed up the counsel that they had provided the president. So in publishing the story that we did on Sunday and publishing the chart that we did that showed, Trump's impact, we published thousands and thousands of words from two drafts of the memos that lay out, and you can see what the counsel's office told Trump.
Why did they smuggle them out?
Why did they smuggle them?
Like, why didn't they send him to Democrats on the Judiciary Committee or send him over to the FBI, which was by 18 investigating Donald Trump for obstruction of justice?
Well, Mueller's team knew about the memos. Mueller's team knew about Trump's attempts to weaponize the government. But Mueller's team took a very narrow posture. And Trump legally could meddle in Justice Department investigations, and they were very serious about the four corners of their investigation. So they knew about the memos. They had discussions about trying to get the memos. They knew if they did that, and they asked Emmett Flood, who was the White House lawyer at the time for him, he wasn't going to give it to them. They could have pushed on witnesses to get it. And there's a quote in the story from one of the Mueller team prosecutors, and one of the Mueller team prosecutors, they have a book that's coming out, and that tells their side of the story of the whole investigation, not about this. And he says that, look, not all conduct that's awful is illegal. Mm-hmm. And this was some of the worst conduct that they saw. But it's not a central, there's some hints of it, and there's a little bit of stuff about Trump trying to use the Justice Department in the Mueller report, but it is not a central theme.
And when you